Okay, everybody. So, hello and welcome to Lecture 4 in the Politics of Religion, otherwise known as, let's see if I can get through a lecture without messing something up, which would be nice for once. And this is the second of two lectures where we're looking at the substantive and the functional definitions of religion. So in the previous lecture, we were discussing the substantive side of religion, so looking at sort of beliefs and doctrines, and this was through the lens of the relationship between science and religion. And in this lecture, I'm going to talk about the functional side of religion a bit, in terms of things like values and social relationships and so on, insofar as it relates to the issue of morality. And the idea that there is a unique link between religion and morality is a really common one, but the spoiler alert here, so cover your ears up if you don't want to know what the surprise is that there is no unique link between religion and morality, according to the studies and according to the literature and according to the evidence that we have. But there might possibly be a link between religion and morality from an unexpected source. So there is a potential twist in the tale. Anyway, the plan for today looks like this. First of all, I'm going to talk about the concept of morality itself. Then, secondly and thirdly, I'm going to go through some of the main arguments for and against this proposition, right? So I'm going to go through some of the main arguments to say that there is a link between religion and morality, and then I'm going to go through a bunch of arguments to say that there isn't a link between religion and morality, or at least a unique link. And then finally, I'm going to talk for a bit about the origins of morality in terms of where this might possibly come from, and then, right at the end, the potential link to religion in all of this. So the first thing we need to do then is set out exactly what we mean by morality, and this leads us to the first problem that we have, because there is no single kind of morality. So when people say that religion and morality are sort of uniquely connected, well, the first thing you need to just think of is, well, what kind of morality are you talking about? So philosophers have divided this up in various different ways, and three of the main varieties are deontological morality, consequentialism, and virtue ethics. For those of you who hate political theory, don't worry, because I'm not going to spend too long on this particular section. You can just sort of, close your eyes and get through it as best you can, I suppose. But the first of these is deontological morality, and this is defined by an emphasis on moral rules and duties that are defined in universal terms. So these are rules that are black and white codes of behaviour. They apply in each and every circumstance. There's no grey areas, there's no nuance. It's either this or that. They're very clear, very straightforward rules. So an example of this would be, which I'm sure you can already think of them, a rule which said it was always immoral to kill, or it was always immoral to lie, or it's always immoral to listen to Kanye West, or something like this, right? Regardless of the circumstances, there is never a good reason to do any of these things. And that would be deontological morality. The second type of morality is called consequentialism, and this focuses on the, surprise, surprise, the consequences or the outcomes of particular behaviour. For instance, in the utilitarian framework, which fans of political theory will sort of know all about this, favoured by people like John Stuart Mill or Jeremy Bentham, a moral course of action is defined by whatever is best for the greatest number of people. So from this perspective, it may, in some circumstances, be permissible or even a duty to kill somebody or to listen to Kanye West. I don't think that's ever permissible, to be honest, but nevertheless, let's broaden the horizons a bit. If this means that the outcomes for the greatest number of people criteria is met. And there's a very famous example of this, which I know you all have heard of, and this is the trolley problem. And so the classic formulation here is that there's a runaway train, and it's heading towards a group of workers, and you, from some peculiar happenstance of fate, just happen to be standing by the side of the track right next to a lever that you, for some reason, know that you can pull. And if you pull this lever, it will divert the train away from the unfortunate 5 workers who are there doing their job, fixing the track, and who are likely to be killed by the runaway train. If you pull this lever, this is the dilemma, you save the 5 workers because you direct the train onto a different track, but unfortunately, there is also a worker on that particular track, and they are going to be killed. There's also, as you can see here on the where is it for you? Yeah, on the right-hand side, there's another formulation of this where there's a person on a bridge. You happen to be walking across a bridge, and there's somebody on the bridge, and you can push the person off the bridge and stop the train. I've never understood why pushing someone off a bridge would stop a train. I can't think of any particular reason why that's going to happen, but nevertheless, this comes up in this particular scenario as well. The basic point of this is that you face the dilemma of pulling the lever to save 5 people at the expense of killing one particular person, and obviously the moral dilemma here is, what should you do? Well, from a consequentialist perspective, the answer is that you should take the course of action that saves one person, even if that saves 5 people, even if it means killing the one person, because you're measuring the moral outcomes by the consequences. There was, by the way, a TV show I saw once. They did this setup. You know, it was one of these practical joke shows where they got people in a room. They were at a theme park or something, and they asked them to come into this room, and they had the train going around the theme park. And then the person who was monitoring everything said, I need to take this a very important phone call. It's for a job. Can you monitor the station for me for 5 minutes? And they kind of ran away. And then this situation unfolded, right? You saw this train coming. And the whole point of this was to test the trolley problem, because this is one of those abstract theoretical things, right? And people like to go, yeah, of course, I would pull it to save 5 people, even if it means killing one person, because that's, you know, the consequences and all the rest of it. And what it found in this particular example was that people froze when they were presented with this situation and did absolutely nothing because they were just completely petrified, and this was so far outside their comfort zone. So these things might work as sort of nice moral intellectual exercises, but in terms of practical recommendations, they don't seem to go very far. Anyway, that's consequentialism. The third approach, or the third type of morality, is called virtue ethics, and the key focus here is on the person's intentions behind the action that they are taking. So if somebody has a virtuous or a well-intentioned or an ethical intention behind the thing that they're doing, then that is considered to be a moral act, even if the outcomes of that act are quite unfortunate or, you know, lead to particular rules breaking or anything like this, right? So an action is considered to be moral as measured by the intentions of the person taking it. Now, all of this brings us to the first key point of this lecture, which is that different religions have different ideas of morality. So broadly speaking, monotheistic religions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, tend to have a deontological perspective towards morality, right? These are black and white moral codes set out in scriptures. The most obvious example here, of course, being the 10 Commandments, right? Nowhere in the 10 Commandments does it say, thou shalt not kill, unless, you know, read the small print, here's a list of options and different criteria. If you happen to be standing by the side of a track and a runaway train, you're good to go, right? It doesn't say anything like that. It's simply black and white codes of behaviour. And monotheistic religions tend to subscribe to deontological moral codes. In contrast, non-monotheistic religions like Buddhism, Jainism, and Hinduism, and yes, we have mentioned this in class, there are interpretations of Hinduism that say it's a monotheistic worldview, and, you know, that can tend to get a bit blurry around the edges, but nevertheless, most people, I think, will view it as a polytheistic religion. Non-monotheistic religions tend towards consequentialist or virtue ethics approaches to morality. It's not always clear which one they fit into. So if you're looking into Sikhism, for example, you know, there's views of Sikhism which will say it's consequentialist. There are others which will say it's about virtue ethics. So it's not always entirely clear which one it is, but nevertheless, they tend not to be deontological. That's the key point. So religions break down in different ways, and this complicates this initial statement, right, again, because if you're going to say there is a link between religion and morality, well, A, you've got this problem of different types of morality, and then B, you've got the problem of different religions breaking off in different ways, subscribing to different moral approaches. So you can't make this very, very unilinear, obvious link. So the second basic point of this lecture is that the idea of a link between religion and morality is not as straightforward as it might first appear. There are different types of religion, there are different types of morality, and there is no clear or obvious line between them. Nevertheless, as I said at the top of the lecture, a very common claim, and we see this in sort of media and culture, and we see this in the academic literature, is that there is a strong and unique link between religion and morality, and the two things just go together. They are, in a sense, a perfect fit. So there are good reasons why people might think this. Many religions, as we know, because we've spoke about how religions can be defined, will put a very strong emphasis on moral codes, whether it's Christianity and the Ten Commandments, or whether it's Islam, talking about zakat, for example, which is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, which requires Muslims to give 2.5% of their annual income to the less well-off. Or there's also the principle of ahimsa, which is a dharmic principle for the dharmic religions, which are sort of Buddhism, Sikhism, Hinduism, and Jainism, and this will be a principle of non-violence. So you have to go through life picking courses of action that minimise the amount of violence that you inflict upon the world, and this would be things like, vegetarianism and so on. So lots of religions have moral codes, moral ideas embedded within them, and we also find lots of organisations, religious organisations out there doing good things in the world. CAFOD, for example, the Catholic Agency for Overseas Development, or there's also Muslim Aid or Christian Aid, or charities like Barnardo's, or the Trussell Trust. I don't know if you've heard of the Trussell Trust, a Christian organisation, one of the largest providers of food banks in the UK. So you can find lots of religious individuals out there doing good deeds, you can find lots of religious organisations out there doing good deeds, and religions themselves promote particular moral codes. So it's not particularly hard to see where this idea of a link between religion and morality might come from. Okay, I'm going to give you some more. One of the main themes in the literature on this particular point centres on a concept called social capital. This was developed, if you haven't heard of it before, it was developed by scholars like Pierre Bourdieu and Robert Putnam, and it refers to the shared values and interconnections that exist within and between social groups, which is a very long-winded way of saying, really, it's kind of like the social glue. Social capital is the stuff that binds society and binds groups together. And it's been linked to lots and lots of positive civic and individual outcomes, right? Social capital is generally regarded as a good thing, and it would be good if societies had more of it. It leads, for example, to improved personal well-being, leads to higher levels of social trust, lower levels of crime, higher levels of educational attainment, greater levels of social cohesion, enhanced political engagement, loads and loads of good things that happen at the social level and at the individual level. And one of the key claims in the literature here is that there is a very strong link between religion and social capital. And the idea here is that religion provides a unique mechanism for generating and sustaining social capital. So, for example, the main mechanisms for this are, well, first of all, we have the moral codes of religion. So if you're a religious believer and you subscribe to these moral codes, this is obviously going to inspire you to behave in moral ways, and that's going to help to generate social capital. A second mechanism is, again, this is sort of the 3Bs type scenario. So we've got beliefs would be number one. Secondly would be belonging. So this would be people going along to a place of worship, becoming involved with religious organisations, and then when they're there, because religious organisations generally promote good things, or they like to go out into the community and do good deeds like helping the homeless, helping the poor and so on, doing charitable activities, if you go to a place of worship, you're likely to be asked at some point to take part in these kinds of activities. So it's not just that people turn up to places of worship, you know, sing a few songs, say a few hymns, and they all go away again. They get involved with practical, socially beneficial activities, and this has a consequence of bringing more people into those activities. Thirdly, is the issue of religious resources. So religious groups tend to be quite sizable. They tend to have national level networks and infrastructure. So they tend to have the kinds of resources that they can put into these sorts of projects, right? Whereas if you sign up to your local book club, you know, and you meet up with like half a dozen people once a week and you talk about the books that you've read, you're not likely to have the kind of resources that would allow you to go out and start to run a food bank, for example, right? Whereas religious organisations, because they're bigger, wealthier, have more people, they have these greater resources that they can draw upon. So this is the sort of mechanics behind it, right? This is the explanation why religious organisations and religious individuals are better at generating social capital according to the literature. And this argument also has very clear political implications. So the claim that religious groups are uniquely well equipped to create social capital has been frequently used by governments. It provides a really good justification for policymakers who want to engage with religious groups in various different ways, various different policy issues. So we can see, for example, this was Joe Biden, who on his very first day back in office expanded or re-established and then expanded the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, which channeled $3 billion to faith-based organizations on the grounds that they could be used to help to reach, they could be used to channel funds and resources to hard-to-reach members of the population, right? So the government, the state, has a sort of limited reach. Lots of people don't trust government, they don't trust the state, they're very disengaged from these kinds of things. Whereas if you bring faith groups into the equation, they can kind of reach these people so you can expand your delivery of social services. We've also seen in the UK, for example, there's a thing called the Faith New Deal Fund, which has been live since 2021 and has provided £4.5 million to religious groups so they can use their religious spaces as local hubs for providing community services. We also had, in the UK, that we don't have anymore, but there was for a time, it was called the Minister for Faith and Communities, right? And obviously the assumption here is that faith and communities would naturally go together, right? You didn't have a Minister for Faith and a Minister for Communities. The two things were sort of rolled up as one. And there was also, I'm not going to go into this, but David Cameron, don't know if you've ever heard of David Cameron's, not just have you heard of David Cameron, although you could be forgiven for asking that question as well, actually, but there's a thing called the Big Society Programme. And one of the big ideas of the Conservatives when they were elected with part of the coalition was to have this thing called the Big Society, where you would empower religious organisations to go and provide welfare services to people. And cynics were saying, well, this is just a way of covering up austerity, right? So the government's going to cut back all this money, they're not going to fund public services anymore, so you can get religious organisations to step in for free and do the job for you. But anyway, this was the same sort of thing happening in the UK. And in both of these occasions, governments will draw on the literature around social capital to say things like, we know that religious groups are really good at this. We have lots of studies demonstrating all of the good things that they do. Here's the academic literature, and now we're going to justify our policy decisions based on these assumptions. So do these assumptions stack up? Well, I mean, yes, they do. Research in this area does show a clear link between religion and social capital in terms of things like volunteering and making charitable donations. They're two of the biggest ways you can measure social capital, right? Do people volunteer? How much time do they spend volunteering and so on? And do people give money to charity and how much? And studies have found, and there is lots of research on this, it's really, really big. For example, members of a church or a mosque are more likely to join voluntary organisations So if you're a member of a religious group, it has a sort of spillover effect. You're more likely to go and join other voluntary organisations in your community and become involved with them. And people who attend religious services more frequently also tend to make higher financial donations to charity. I'll just give you a couple of examples of this. The top one is from an organisation in the United States called Give.org, who are one of the main organisations for sort of measuring social capital activities. These are figures, I think, from 2024, which found that the non-religious in the United States were more likely than the religious to say that they have given no money to charity at all in the last 3 years. And the non-religious, as a group, were also the most likely to report that they'd given the lowest donation. So this would typically be the lowest category here would be between $1 and $50. And the non-religious were disproportionately clustered in that particular group. And then in the UK, these are figures also from 2024, from the Community Life Survey, found that 74% of Christians and 71% of Muslims had given money to charity in the last 4 weeks, while the figure for the non-religious was just 61%. And as I say, there's lots of studies, lots of evidence. I mean, I could have made this section like half an hour easily, right? There's just lots and lots of evidence on this to demonstrate this point. Religious individuals tend to give more money to charity, tend to become involved more frequently, tend to volunteer more than non-religious individuals. It's a very well-established fact in the literature. In addition to this, still on the arguments why there is a link between religion and morality, there are also various philosophical arguments that come up from time to time, claiming that morality is divinely ordained. This is the idea of objective morality. And one of the most famous examples of this is from this guy who you might have heard of, Immanuel Kant. And this is the idea he's sort of expressing here, right? Two things would sort of basically filled him with awe, the stars above him and the moral law inside him, and neither of these things could be reasonably explained in his view by naturalistic mechanical laws and processes. And so what he's sort of expressing here is that the vast majority of us intuitively recognise a set of moral codes. And so this would be the thing then that would say, if we all intuitively recognise this, morality cannot be a subjective preference. Right, there has to be a reason why we all think roughly the same way about base level morality, and so there must therefore be an objective moral structure to the universe. Now you might consider things like theft and murder and, as we saw in the seminars last week, incest to be morally wrong. This is referencing, of course, the social intuitionist view. But if you say that, that's just simply, and you don't go along with the idea of objective morality, that's just you expressing a preference, right? And this is no more than moral relativism. But even arch atheists like Richard Dawkins would admit that things like this are morally wrong. And so if we all agree on this base level morality, where does it come from? And for people like Kant, the only place it could come from was from a transcendental, divine, supernatural source, i.e. God. So Kant argued then that the existence of this intuitive sense of morality was, in a sense, proof that God existed because it couldn't have come from anywhere else. So there's an objective, the philosophical argument, again, also to say that there is this link between religion and morality. There's another common argument is that, and you might kind of see this again, it's quite common very often in the sort of media, which is the absence of religion causes social problems. And a typical claim here is that, the decline of the West, right? We have rising crime levels and rising levels of family breakdown and drug abuse and lack of discipline and, all these kinds of horrible social things happened when religion started to decline. So there is an idea then that all of these things are somehow linked to the loss of religion. Religion was kind of providing a sort of moral, code for society to follow, and now that's gone and society is sort of rapidly disintegrating. And for those of you, who are kind of following this module at a reasonable level of attention will immediately know that this is referencing the idea of religion from social control theory, right? Religion keeps society in its box, and then when religion declines, society starts to fray at the edges and fall to pieces. That's the argument. So, these are some of the main arguments to say that there is a link between religion and morality. And the next section, I'm going to go through and give you some arguments to say why all of these things are completely false, and there is, in fact, no link between religion and morality. And one of the first things I think it's important to note here is not just, like I said earlier on, that there are different types of religions, different types of morality, and they map onto each other in very different ways. There is also the problem, of course, that not all gods are moral. So when you want to make the claim and say that there is a link between religion and morality, you have an immediate problem here, which is that not all gods behave in moral ways. The idea that God is a moral force is typically, not always, but typically associated with monotheistic religions, and many historical conceptions of religion, like the Greek polytheism or the Roman set of gods, have distinctly immoral types of behaviour, right? They're very often egotistical, vain, violent, quite abusive to each other and to, the humans amongst over whom they lord it. And we certainly wouldn't look to like Thor or Zeus or Odin, as exemplars of moral virtue, right? In addition to this, many other religions, we've mentioned before this idea of folk religions, right? Many folk religions will have sort of local tribal gods. And those sorts of gods, they will have generally, this is very sort of general, but they will have moral codes, but they tend not to have universal moral codes. They tend to have moral codes that apply only to the particular local group in question, right? They're not concerned about the moral behaviour for humanity as a whole, right? It's really, you people who live in this area should do these things, and doesn't mention anybody else beyond the local sort of region. So this is also a problem. And this is also very interesting because there is a lot of research looking at how moral gods emerge and under which conditions they emerge. And I'll talk a little bit more about this next week, but this is a very interesting study by Rose and Raymond, which is on the reading list, and I recommend that you go and have a look at it, which found that belief in gods with moral codes increased with the size and the complexity of the social group in question. So what we have here, the numbers running along the bottom, refer to the different layers of political authority in a society. So societies at level 1 have no political authority whatsoever beyond the immediate community itself. And then by the time you go all the way up to level 5, you're talking about large-scale, complicated societies with multiple levels of authority, right? So you might, in the UK, you've got sort of like local councils, and then you've sort of got national government or devolved government, and then you might have supranational levels, all that kind of stuff, right? Level 5 is the highest, largest, most complex level of society. And as you can see, 4 and 5 aside, there's a general link between the size of and the complexity of society and the number of morally concerned gods that those societies have. And this is a really interesting point that I'm going to come back to later on, because the question here, just to flag this up, is whether this is cause or effect. Does the presence of a moral god enable society to grow above a particular size, or do moral gods become attached to societies once they reach a particular size? This is a really interesting question. But nevertheless, this correlation has been demonstrated. So not all societies have moral gods. Not all gods are moral. Another argument here which challenges this idea of a unique link between religion and morality is the claim that religious individuals might behave morally not because they're particularly virtuous people per se, but because of the rewards and punishments involved. So I mentioned in a previous class how studies have found that people who believe in a caring and compassionate God have been found to be more likely to cheat in laboratory tests than people who subscribe to a strict disciplinarian authoritarian God. The argument here, of course, being that people who believed in a compassionate God believed that they were more likely to be forgiven for cheating whereas people who believed in an authoritarian, disciplinarian God were more afraid of being punished, and so they didn't cheat in the first place. And other studies have found similar things. Not too many quotes today, you'll be relieved to know, but this is research by Alonia and Halberstadt. I think that's how you would pronounce it. And as you can see, this was a study that found that religiosity was associated with a greater probability of cheating in laboratory tests. But the interesting thing was that when they asked people to pray before they put them through the experiment to see if they were going to cheat or not, when religious individuals prayed, their cheating behaviour dropped. So prayer had an effect on cheating, but only for religious individuals, right? If you were a non-religious person, you were asked to pray, it had no effect whatsoever on your behaviour. And the understanding of this was that when religious individuals prayed, that sort of reminded them of the moral codes that they were supposed to follow and the rewards and punishments that would follow from it, and therefore they then behaved morally. But before they were asked to pray, they were more likely to cheat than non-religious individuals. So again, this idea that there's a clear link between religion and morality doesn't quite stack up in terms of the evidence. Number 3, this is a really obvious point, so I'm not going to spend very long on this at all. This is simply the reverse claim, right? That if it can be argued that religion inspires people to do good things, well, it can also inspire people to do some pretty horrible things, right? And there are lots of examples of this, 9/11, as you can see, but we also have cases of religious violence in places like India, Northern Ireland, Afghanistan with the Taliban and so on, or, the Catholic child abuse scandal, so on and so on. I'm not going to belabor this point. You all know what I'm talking about. You can all think of lots of examples of your own. This is the basic argument, right? Religion, yes, it inspires people to do good stuff, but it also inspires people to do some pretty wicked and horrible things at the same time. Point number 4 is about this idea that religion is needed for moral behaviour. This is the claim that when you don't have religion, societies start to degenerate, right? So what I'm showing you here, this is a thing called the Social Capital Index. This is from an organisation called Solability. And what they do is they create a composite measure of social capital for different societies based on things like levels of health, levels of equality, levels of human rights, and so forth. And this is the top 20 list of countries from 2024. And of these countries, probably Ireland, Belgium, Spain, Italy, maybe Portugal would be sort of moderately religious. And Cyprus, Korea, and Timor-Leste would be strongly religious. But the other 12 would be largely non-religious, largely secular, or would have non-religious majorities. In other words, the top 20 countries in the world, in terms of social capital, tend to be not very religious. Let me sort of put it that way. Which challenges the idea that religion is uniquely good for generating social capital, right? Look what happens if we have a look at the bottom 20 of the list. Well, these are highly religious countries. So you'd expect this maybe to be the other way around if the link between religion and social capital was as obvious as is portrayed in the literature. Now this said, and I have made this point before as well, but it is an important one, so I'm just going to kind of underline it here. It's important to bear in mind that correlation is not causation, okay? These figures in this league table do not necessarily demonstrate the relationship between religion and social capital in the way that I may have just portrayed it. It's not necessarily the case that societies have low levels of social capital because they're religious, right? It's not like there's something about religion that causes societies to have very, very low levels of social capital, right? It could be the case, and this is something that we come back to in a couple of weeks. It could be the case that societies are more religious because they have low levels of social capital. It could be the case that it's the low social capital in those societies that is driving the high level of religion. If people live in less developed societies, they probably have harder, more uncertain lives, higher levels of corruption, higher levels of poverty, higher levels of sickness, lack of access to public services, and so on and so on. And may in those circumstances turn to religion as a way of coping with those particular situations. And again, those of you who are paying attention to the module will immediately notice that this is talking about the terror management theory perspective of religion, which provides people with a sense of security in their lives. And so this could possibly be a reason for the data I just showed you. In addition to this, the claim that religion is a unique source of social capital is also hard to sustain for other reasons. And one of them is that it's not entirely clear how much influence religiosity has on driving social capital behaviour. So these figures that I'm showing you here were taken from the National Council for Voluntary Organisations in the UK, right, 2023. And they asked people why they volunteered to help in their communities. Why did you get involved? What was motivating you to go and take part in these sorts of activities, right? And the top one, as you can see, 40% of people said they got involved because they wanted to improve things and they wanted to help people. Second up was that the cause was important to them in some sort of personal way, right? 34%, and so on down the list. Religious belief, there was a list of 15 reasons that people could choose from. Religious belief came in 11th in this list, with just 12% of people saying they were driven, motivated to take part in social capital behaviour by their religious belief. It was not one of the main drivers of religion at all. And figures also show that religious engagement with volunteering and charitable donations might not be as philanthropic and as altruistic as it might first appear. Because while it is true that religious individuals give significant amounts of money to charity, a significant proportion of this money, as well as their voluntary activities, their time and so forth, goes back to religious organisations. So this would be churches, for example, who are also involved, who are charitable bodies themselves, right? Or they set up their own particular charities, but the charities under the umbrella of the religious organisation. You can see here, these are figures from the Charities Aid Foundation from 2025. Religious causes come third in the list of all causes that people donate their money to, £1.2 billion. 8% of all donations go back to religious causes. And the data from the United States is even starker. 3/4 of all charitable giving in the United States, some $146 billion, goes back to religious organisations in some form or another. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with this, of course, and I'm not saying this to try and raise suspicions about religious volunteering and charitable donations, but it does nevertheless raise a question mark over the extent to which this is being completely altruistic and completely philanthropic, or whether there is at least a little bit of self-interest in people giving money to effectively their own religions. So it just sort of puts a little question mark over the nature of that particular philanthropy. And in addition to this is another important point to bear in mind. Not all forms of social capital are necessarily moral. So when we see in the literature that there is a strong link between religion and social capital, and then governments say this is a good thing, so we should promote religious organisations and they should be involved in welfare service delivery, well, it depends on the kind of social capital that they are generating. People in this area will talk about different types of social capital, but two of the main ones, the two big ones, are bonding social capital and bridging social capital. Bridging social capital is the stuff you want to make, right? If you're interested in the health of a democratic society and you're trying to promote good civic outcomes, bridging social capital is about creating greater networks, closer relationships, greater trust and cohesion and so on between different social groups. And that's the thing that generally brings people together. Bonding social capital, on the other hand, is the stuff that works within a particular group. So if ever, you get a job working for some corporation and they take you out on one of these, bonding weekends, right? And you all have to do sort of stunts in the forest and so on. That's generating bonding social capital. It's bringing members of the group together. It's not creating links between you and anybody else. And studies have found that bonding social capital is really good for the group, but it's less beneficial for society as a whole, because it can lead to ideas of in and out group dynamics, othering, prejudice, discrimination, all of those kinds of things. And researchers found that religious organisations are particularly good at generating bonding social capital, especially when we get to the more conservative and fundamentalist side of the scale. So not all forms of social capital are even beneficial. And the final point to make on this is that while there's a lot of research looking at the links between religion and social capital, there is hardly any research looking at the links between non-religion and social capital. And since we don't know that much about non-religion and social capital, we can't really say that religion is a unique form of social capital creation, because we don't know what the non-religious side are getting up to. Maybe the non-religious are just as good as the religious side, and we just don't know about it because nobody has studied it. I say this with a slight hesitation, because I have studied this. I can't go into the full set of results yet because we haven't actually published it. It's due to be sent for publication probably next month. We've done all the data collection, we've done all the analysis and everything else, but it hasn't been peer reviewed, so I can't kind of give you the charts and all the rest of it. But I can tell you, broad brush from the research, from what we have seen, and this was a national survey of members and supporters of Humanists UK and the National Secular Society. So these are people who would consider themselves to be non-religious. And then we compared them to the religious population from other national surveys. And what we found is that the non-religious side tend to do better than the religious population in lots of different areas, like social trust, for example. Volunteering, charitable donations tend to be higher, in our sample at least. So that's quite interesting. But what we've also found is that there's a distinction between different non-religious identities. And I've mentioned before, we spoke about this in one of the first seminars, right? When you tick the box for non-religion, it's pretty meaningless, because the box for non-religion includes humanists, atheists, agnostics, spiritual but not religious, etc., etc., etc. But when you break that down, what we found is that humanists tend to be better at social capital activities than atheists. Give more money to charity, spend more time volunteering, have higher levels of trust, and so on and so on. So the non-religious generally do quite well, and humanists do particularly well. So there is, it seems, some kind of humanist effect at work in the non-religion box. Okay, so those are some of the reasons why this idea of a link between religion and morality might not be as clear-cut as we're sometimes presented with. But all of this then raises an interesting question, which is, well, if there's no obvious link between religion and morality, where does morality come from? Kant would be puzzled by this, right? Because he thinks it comes from a divine source. If it doesn't come from a divine source, then where does it come from? Well, research into moral reasoning, this is, for example, putting people in MRI scans and then asking them to think about the trolley problem and then taking a scan of their brain and seeing which parts light up, does find that certain parts of the brain are activated when people think about moral dilemmas and moral problems. So there seems to be a link between moral issues and certain specific cognitive processes. And since the brain is an evolved organ, in most cases, this suggests that there could be an evolutionary account of moral behaviour. And this is supported by research which finds that the basic level of morality does seem to apply across all human societies. Now, obviously, there are variations between them, but certain behaviours like not killing, not stealing, helping out your family, returning favours, these are almost universally followed. In other words, there seems to be a basic moral template ingrained in our cognitive functions. question then is why? Now, one part of the answer could be that morality evolved as a way of resolving conflict and enabling cooperation in social groups. This is a really important problem for social groups to solve, because unresolved conflicts can undermine social cohesion and can undermine, if you imagine going back tens of thousands of years, if you have a group which is not particularly social cohesive and they're all arguing with each other and falling out with each other and having dramas, and they kind of can't get along, that group is not going to be particularly well attuned for survival and is probably going to struggle, right, as the Ice Age comes in and all the rest of it, and everyone has to work together. But this then poses a problem, because if most people in a society behave altruistically, if everybody's just doing things because they're following this cognitive template and they're nice people and all the rest of it, then free riders are going to have a field day with this, because free riders can just take advantage of the group, can sponge off all their resources without contributing anything back. This is exactly the example we had in the seminars last week, talking about the differences between strict and more relaxed religions, right? So it's the same scenario playing out. And if that happens, if free riders become involved in the group is again going to become weaker and less cohesive. So how do we explain the existence of altruism? Well, there are different ways of explaining this. One idea that was proposed was from a guy called William Hamilton, and this was the concept of kin selection. And this argued that because processes of natural selection, Charles Darwin and all of that, will favour behaviours that increase your reproductive success, i.e. the number of genes that get passed on, then altruism, like self-sacrifice, giving up resources, giving up time, giving up energy, and so on, for your own children and your own family, has an evolutionary advantage, because in your own family, your parents, your siblings, your children and so on, they are also carrying your genes around inside them, right? You all basically share the same genetic pool. So self-sacrifice for those parts of society makes perfect sense from an evolutionary standpoint. So kin selection was one of the initial ways to explain this. One problem with this was that it only worked for very small groups, or groups of people that had a high chance of being, related to each other, right? But this doesn't really work when you have larger societies. So how do we explain altruism in larger groups? Well, another approach that was put forward was this idea called reciprocal altruism. And this is basically you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, or essentially follow the golden rule that religions will espouse, right? Do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. And what basically happens here is it's all about your social reputation. So if you're living in a society, and we're still talking about relatively small groups of people here, right? Maybe a few hundred. If you're living in a society of that number of people and you help somebody out, you will, or you do it, somebody does you a favor and you return it, right? Then you gain a reputation as being the kind of person that can be trusted. Whereas, if you cheat on somebody, then you very rapidly gain the reputation of being a person who cannot be trusted. And so this is the way of weeding out free riders in slightly larger social groups, right? Through the reputational process. In other words, gossip. People will talk to each other and they will say, that person can't be trusted. I shared my dinosaur burger with them when they were hungry and they never gave me one back later in the week. Don't trust them anymore. That person's in big trouble because, you can't really survive outside the group. And so this is the mechanism that holds society together and deals with free riders. But what do you do when societies get even larger and it becomes easier for free riders to remain anonymous? What do you do in situations where they can just cruise around and cheat people, right? That is going to undermine the social cohesion of the group. And what is the mechanism by which you catch these free riders? Well, part of the answer here could be the rise of gods concerned with moral affairs. In other words, moral high gods in the literature. These are gods that are morally concerned that know what you're thinking, that see all your behavior, that know your intentions, that can regulate behavior through social punishments, or obviously the big punishment is wait and see what happens after you die, right? And you don't follow the moral codes and you're in big trouble. If we have this idea of, in short, a supernatural watcher, this potentially could be the mechanism that allows society to go beyond the size limit that it had previously and create larger scale, more complicated social units, leading ultimately to the rise of human civilization itself. And so here, there could possibly be a role for religion in morality. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where I am leaving it for today. So thanks again for coming, and that's it. I'll see you all next time.